What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. I'm currently in the United States, in South Carolina, spending time with family and friends, traveling around South Carolina and Georgia, visiting with loved ones. It's been great to reconnect with a few friends that I haven't seen in many years, and those relationships should not be underestimated. It's quite powerful, these connections we have with loved ones. And so I've really been enjoying that. I'll be heading back to Chile, to our retreat center in January for the busy season with our yoga school and our retreat center. It's summer in the southern hemisphere right now, and it's quite cold here in the northern hemisphere right now in December. Today I would like to share a few experiences, personal experiences that I've had of out-of-body experiences, a near-death experience, and an astral travel, so-called experience. Now, I will not be sharing all of such experiences, but just the ones that have been most impactful in my life and my spiritual path. And so if you are unfamiliar with out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences or astral travel experiences, then I would ask you to do a bit of research so that you can understand the background of what I'll be discussing. But I'm sure for the vast majority of my listeners, you all are already familiar with these kinds of experiences. Now, there are some spiritual teachers who try to dissuade people from sharing their spiritual experiences, which I've never understood. I should say that it is quite dependent upon one's motivation or intention when one decides to share their spiritual experiences or personal stories and whatnot. If one is attempting to impress people with their spiritual experiences, then this is a tamasic motivation and a selfish, ego-based motivation. However, if one wishes to share their experiences with others in an attempt to inspire others, then it can have a very sattvic quality to it. And one can say that their intention or motivation is quite sattvic and selfless. And so, in sharing my personal spiritual experiences, I have no intention to impress anyone. Seems kind of silly even to think about it, but I suppose there are those people who share their spiritual experiences in an attempt to gain some sort of social currency or social status. This happens. It is true. As a matter of fact, there is a podcast or a YouTube channel that I like called Buddha at the Gas Pump, where the host interviews spiritual teachers and people that are waking up spiritually. And I have noticed that in those interviews that many people, not everyone, treat their spiritual experiences as a sort of status symbol, as a sort of social currency, and people's awakening experiences or spiritual experiences are treated much like, a sports car or a luxury car. And so this phenomenon does exist, people trying to improve their social status within spiritual circles and spiritual subgroups by sharing their spiritual experiences or awakening experiences. There are people who do use those experiences much like, a shallow person would use a BMW to impress their friends with in their social circles and subgroups. This is true. This does go on. I assure you, I have no interest in trying to impress anyone with my stories or my spiritual experiences. I merely wish to inspire you, so that you can know that your spiritual pursuits and your spiritual practices are not in vain, and that they will pay off in the end, and you will reap the benefits and rewards of your discipline, of your spiritual discipline, and that all this is real. Okay? So again, my intention is to inspire you by sharing with you some of my more profound or impactful experiences. Okay? So I'll go in sequential order. I want to first talk about a near-death experience I had when I was 25. I used to be an avid whitewater kayaker, and I really messed up my hip doing that for many years, and my shoulder as well. So now I only go about once a year or so, and but I used to go, once a week for years. Even in the winter months when I was living here in the Southeast. That's one of the great things about living in the Southeast, is that you can go kayaking year-round, basically. And of course you can do that in Colorado or, Idaho or whatever if you're so inclined, but you got to be a little bit wacky to want to do that. Here in the Southeast, the water never gets too terribly cold, even in the winter. I mean, it's cold, but it's doable. At any rate, so I was on the, what river was it? The Cartacay, which is near Ellijay, Georgia. And it's typically a class 3 river, nothing too crazy. But on this particular adventure, it happened to be flood stage. And so I went up there with a few friends, and it was, it goes from class 3 to class 5 pretty quickly, depending on the levels. And it was certainly class 5 that day. And so we made our way down the river, and didn't have any issues until we got to this area that they call the whirlpool. because it does move in a sort of circular motion. The water, there is a sort of circular current that occurs in this one section of the river, and so they call it the whirlpool. Well, that day it had created a nice spot to play, to surf. All of you whitewater enthusiasts out there know what I'm talking about. It's where you essentially face upriver in your boat and you intentionally go into a rapid that has created a sort of standing wave, and you're able to get into this pocket where you can surf the standing wave and you're inside your kayak. They call it play boating, basically. And we found a nice standing wave there, and so a couple of my friends got in it, and they were much more experienced at that time, much better kayakers than I was at that time, and they didn't really have any issues. Well, I got in there and flipped over a couple times. I was able to come back up. I had a pretty good roll, but it just kept flipping me over, flipping me over, flipping me over. And at some point I had to pull my spray skirt off and swim. And as soon as I did that, the river pulled me down to the riverbed, the floor, and started to churn me around like I was in a washing machine or a dryer, just over and over again. And it would allow me to come up for air here and there, and I would just take a quick breath and go right back under. And I continued to struggle and continued to struggle, and then at one point it pulled me really deep, and I was tired, I was exhausted, I didn't have any more strength in my arms to try and swim or anything like that, and I gave up. And I decided it was my time. Okay, it's my time to go. I'm gonna die. Just accept it. It is what it is. It's over. And this, by the way, I had been under for about 2 minutes when I finally decided that. And it was just churning me around. It wasn't letting me come back up. It wasn't spitting me out. And I had been down there for about 2 minutes or so, and I could feel my lungs were starting to fill up with water a bit. And I was gonna die. And so I gave in to the situation. I accepted it. And I surrendered. I fully surrendered. And just about that time, when I had surrendered and accepted the fact that I was about to die, there was a bright white light that appeared in my mind's eye. Just a pure white light. It wasn't a tunnel, as some people have described. I never saw a tunnel or anything like that. Just a pure, bright white light. And it was extremely tranquil and peaceful and loving. Is the only way I can describe it. Just perfect peace. Extremely still and peaceful and tranquil, serene. And I didn't experience that tranquil, blissful light again until I began meditating super consciously under the tutelage of my spiritual guide, Roy Eugene Davis, many years later. Well, not many years later, let's say 4 years later. But at any rate, so I perceived this beautiful, piercing, brilliant white light. and this sense of peace and stillness and freedom. Total freedom. Almost a sense of having been freed from my cage. I often think of this body as a cage, as a prison. And momentarily, at least, I had been somewhat freed from this cage, from this prison. And there was a sense of bliss, of liberty, of love, of light, of peace, of freedom, and divinity. Now, this entire experience with the light and this sense of freedom and bliss and peace probably only lasted a few seconds. And it's hard to understand, how can something so profound and life-changing only last for a few seconds? But oftentimes this is the case with spiritual experiences. At any rate, so this lasted for a few seconds, and right about the time that I had surrendered and decided that it was okay to die, there was not a voice, but a message, a divine message that essentially said, no, it's not your time yet. You have unfinished business here on this physical plane, and you have things left to take care of or accomplish in this life as this particular Chris character that you're playing, and it's not your time. You have a mission. There are things for you to do on this planet before you go. And again, this was not in words. It was just an intuitive message that I received and downloaded basically at that time. And just as soon as I had received that message, the river spat me out from the bottom, spat me out towards one of the shores. And I remember my head coming up out of water and seeing my friends there, freaking out, panicking, not knowing what to do, how to save me. And I swam with every, energy reserve that I had left in my body. I swam toward the shore and coughed a lot, and but I was fine. I was totally fine, and I didn't have any, brain damage or anything like that. And I survived. Now, I would love to tell you that immediately thereafter, I changed my life, cleaned up some bad habits, and started living a better life and all these things. However, that would have to wait a few years. But it was life-changing or life-altering in the sense that I knew that death wasn't a negative experience or a painful experience or a bad experience. I had this sense that it's okay to die. It's not such a big deal, and actually it's quite ecstatic. The experience of death is quite blissful and wonderful. And so that stuck with me to this day. And so I do have to say that it did alleviate or eliminate a lot of my fear of dying or my fear of death. And to this day, I have no fear of death. You may find that difficult to believe, but I just don't. I know it's not anything to be afraid of, and that it's quite beautiful, actually. It's quite lovely. And especially after my out-of-body experiences, which I'll explain next, well, I realized that, oh no, next I'll explain my astral experience. But after those out-of-body experiences, I realized that we are not the body. We are not the body. And that even if the body dies, we continue on our sojourn. In about 2013, I was living in Colorado, and I started practicing a bit of Tibetan dream yoga. I was introduced to a teacher of Tibetan dream yoga. If you're not familiar with Tibetan dream yoga, I would encourage you to do a little bit of research. It's a fascinating tradition, fascinating path. And I met someone who taught Tibetan dream yoga and was a student of a fairly well-known Tibetan dream yoga guru from Tibet. Well, from Nepal. He was from Nepal, but he was a Tibetan Buddhist from Nepal, living in, well, I don't want to say exactly where he was living. I don't want anyone trying to look this guy up. He's extremely private, and he doesn't want people chasing him down, asking him to teach them Tibetan dream yoga. I just happened to be very fortunate at the time. It's kind of a long story. At any rate, I'd prefer not to mention my teacher's name or his guru's name. It's a very secretive practice and an initiatory practice that should be learned directly from a master of Tibetan dream yoga. It's extremely powerful, and it's not a toy to be played with. It's a serious practice. At any rate, I had been taught some of the protocols and whatnot regarding the process at night before you go to sleep. You follow this routine, this sequence, in order to get into this state where one is able to dream lucidly and consciously, and where one is able to interact with others on this astral plane, as it were. And so, one night I did the procedures as I had been taught, and with the instruction from my teacher that he would visit me, or he would attempt to visit me in my dream and teach me something, interact, what have you. And I had mentioned to him that I have these recurring dreams where I'm levitating. I've had them since I was very young. I don't fly in the sense that, I'm not looking like Superman flying through the sky. I'm in a lotus position, cross-legged, levitating, floating around. And I've had that dream since I was very young. Cross-legged in a lotus position, levitating, floating around, seeing everything from above and whatnot. But I mentioned to him that in my dreams, I was unable to control the direction in which I was flying, or my height, my altitude, and all of that. And that it was not typically a very lucid experience. I was not in control of that experience. And so that night, sure enough, my teacher visited me in my dream on this astral plane, in this astral dimension. And sure enough, he taught me a pranayama technique, a breathing technique that one can use to control one's direction, frontward, backward, left, right, and also one's altitude or elevation. And it worked, and I was completely lucid, completely conscious, and I was able to control my flight. And am still able to do that to this day using this particular technique that I learned that night in this astral dimension with this teacher. But I have to say, and I had many lucid dreams prior to that, and many astral explorations and whatnot, but I wish to only share this one story with you at this time. And at any rate, so I learned this technique. I was able to control my levitation and my flight in this astral dimension where I was interacting with this teacher. And I have to say that in this dimension, there were other students interacting with other gurus at the time. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it was a fascinating experience. However, I have to say that it was quite uncomfortable for me because, the next morning, for example, we both happened to be, I don't want to say too much, we worked at the same place, let's say. And so in the morning, I saw this teacher, and he approached me, and he asked me, "How was that for you last night? Did you enjoy the technique? Did you find it useful and all of this?" And at that point, I knew it was 100% real, and that it had been an absolutely real experience on a real astral plane, and that it is possible to interact with others in these astral planes, especially at night in the sleeping state. Well, I kind of freaked out, to be perfectly honest with you. The thought of someone inside my mind didn't really appeal to me. Not all of my dreams and everything are so, pure and holy. So, at any rate, the thought of having someone inside my mind was quite disconcerting at the time. And so I told him that I no longer wanted to practice Tibetan Dream Yoga, and that he did not have my permission to infiltrate my mind, or perhaps he wasn't in my mind. It's maybe not the best way of explaining it, but at any rate, I stopped. I decided I no longer wanted to participate in that process with him. And maybe that was immature of me. Maybe that wasn't the most mature decision to make at the time. But at any rate, I decided it was for the best. And so after that experience, I did not have any other experiences working with people in those astral, well, that's not entirely true, but with this particular teacher, yeah, I stopped working with that particular teacher at that time because it just made me feel very uncomfortable. I just wasn't ready to have those kinds of experiences. It was a bit too much. It was kind of overwhelming and everything. And so I put an end to that. But it was a fascinating experience, and it did prove to me the validity of these astral planes, where one can interact with teachers and other people. And so, and I've had other astral experiences that I won't go into. They're very personal. But let's just say that these astral planes, these astral dimensions are real, and that one can travel with one's astral body to these other dimensions and planes and have some very interesting and enlightening experiences. It's all real. Tibetan Dream Yoga is real. The astral plane or planes are real. And it is possible for one to travel, so-called. You're not really going anywhere, of course. But one can exist as an astral being in these astral planes, even while one is embodied. So in other words, you don't have to wait until you're dead and the body is no longer viable to have astral experiences. One can have astral experiences while embodied. It's 100% real. It is true. In 2016, I was here actually in the same house visiting my parents in South Carolina. And I went to take a nap in the guest room where I stay. And I began to fall asleep, but I was in a state of reverie, which is that state in between sleeping and wakefulness, where you're kind of going in and out of sleep. And in one moment, my body began to vibrate. Uncontrollably. In other words, I wasn't attempting to do anything. I wasn't trying to do anything. I wasn't following any yoga nidra protocols or Tibetan dream yoga protocols or anything like that. I was just taking a normal nap. And I was in a state of reverie. And all of a sudden my body, especially my spine, started to shake, vibrate. And the way I describe it is that I felt very loose. I felt very loose. That's the only way I can describe it. Like my astral body was no longer tightly encapsulated within the physical body. There was a sense of freedom and a sort of ability to leave, an ability to move about without the sort of constricting nature, as it were, of the physical, dense body cage, as it were. So, at any rate, my body began to shake and vibrate, and again, I felt very loose in that moment. And a few moments later, I popped out. I just popped out. And I began to hover over my body. And when this happened, I was energetic, so I had this energy body, we'll call it the astral body. I had a mind, and I had awareness. But I have to say that the mind wasn't really a thinking mind. It was more just like this pure awareness. And there were some thoughts involved, but they didn't include words or language. This part is hard to describe, but it's like the mind still had a capacity to think, but the thoughts were not comprised of words or language. It was more just like these intuitive flashes and instinctual flashes of knowledge, but without words or language. It's difficult to describe for one who's not had this experience. At any rate, so I popped out of my body and I began to hover or float over my body. And I looked down and I saw my body. And again, this was not a thought with words, but essentially I had I sort of received this message that, oh, okay, you're not that. That thing you're looking at down there, that's not what you are. Which was really cool. And so I started to float up toward the ceiling. About the time that I started to pass through the ceiling, I freaked out. I panicked, and I immediately shot back down into my body quite dramatically and harshly, forcefully, let's say. And I woke up. It woke me up because it was so forceful. And there was so much fear involved. And so, I have to say, I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that I panicked and was quite afraid, which is weird because, as I've told you already, I really don't have much fear of death. And so it wasn't really fear of death, it was a fear of unknowing, let's say. A fear of the unknown, maybe. And just being uncomfortable. You know, just not understanding the experience because it was the first time it had ever happened. And I just wasn't ready for it at the time. And it was disconcerting, it was uncomfortable. I wasn't used to, you know, being outside of my body, floating around, looking down at my body. And so I did freak out as soon as I started to pass through the ceiling and forcefully re-entered my body, and I woke up. And by the way, had a normal day the rest of the day. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like an enlightenment sort of experience, like a samadhi sort of experience, like I've had before. This was simply an out-of-body experience. And so I didn't necessarily feel any more enlightened afterwards. Depends on your definition of that word, I suppose. But I did have this knowingness that I am not the body. 100%. And so a lot of people, religious people, believe in the soul, or maybe believe in the astral body and things of that nature. And they believe, you see, that they are not their body. And they believe that the soul exists, and they believe that the astral body exists, or they believe that they continue on once the body is dead. They believe that they exist outside of the body, or beyond the confines of the physical body and form. They believe that, you see, but they don't know it. But once you've had an out-of-body experience, you know it. It's different. It's different than a belief. You know, my spiritual teacher always told us, don't be a believer, be a knower. Don't be a believer, be a knower. And so I've tried to follow that particular piece of advice throughout my spiritual journey. And it is true that it is much better to be a knower than a believer. Because believers, see, if you believe something, it implies that there's still some doubt. But once you know something, there's no doubt. And so I know I'm not my body. I know I know that once the body dies, that we continue to exist. I know that. I 100% know that. I don't believe it. I know it. I've experienced it. And so, again, I was energy, mind, and awareness. But the mind was more pure in the sense that I didn't have any thoughts. Now, this whole experience only lasted maybe 10 seconds. I floated above my body for about 10 seconds or so until I hit the ceiling, and then I re-entered my body. The whole experience lasted maybe 10 seconds. It was like that near-death experience that lasted about the same amount of time. Very short experience, but incredibly impactful and profound. Yeah, important part of the story. So following the experience, about a week after that, I visited my teacher's retreat center there in the North Georgia mountains when he was still alive and embodied. And I went to visit him, and I told him about my experience, and he had had a very similar experience, almost identical experience, at around the same age that I had had my experience. And he told me, that's very interesting. Yeah, I was also taking a nap, and I was in a state of reverie. And my body started to vibrate, and I just popped out and started floating up toward the ceiling, and found the experience a little bit disconcerting, and decided to return to my body. Now, he didn't have like full-on fear like I did, but an incredibly similar experience. And so that was very reassuring to me to know that this experience had been validated by my spiritual teacher, and that it was very much a real experience and not some imagined fantasy, as it were. And that's why it's good to have a spiritual teacher, by the way, on the path that can guide you, that has a lot of experience. A couple of years after that, I was having a medical procedure done, and a colonoscopy and an endoscopy at the same time. I don't mind telling you, I do have digestive issues, so every few years I get a colonoscopy and endoscopy done. And so, they put you under. They give you anesthesia for that. And so I went in for the procedure, and they gave me anesthesia. And a few minutes later, I popped out of my body and was able to watch part of the procedure, which was strange to say the least. And it's interesting because I'm allergic to latex. And so I had told the doctors ahead of time, please don't use latex gloves, please use this other kind of glove. And so, they knew they weren't supposed to use latex gloves. Now, during the procedure, I watched a nurse start to put on latex gloves. Okay? And I somehow tried to tell her not to. I somehow tried to tell her, I don't remember the details of it, but essentially I was trying to interact with her and tell her, please don't put those latex gloves on. And sure enough, as soon as I did that, the doctor turned to the nurse and said, "Oh no, don't use those latex gloves. Use these other gloves. Go wash your hands and throw those away, whatever." And she did. So she went and she threw these latex gloves into this little waste basket off to the side next to a sink. And she washed her hands. She put on the other gloves. Now, when I came out of the procedure, when I woke up, they put me in a wheelchair to roll me out. When they put me in that wheelchair, it was right in front of that waste basket. And sure enough, I looked down and I saw the latex gloves sitting in the waste basket. And so I had, in fact, witnessed that entire thing going down. Also, this time I didn't have the fear that I had had previously. Because I had already had that previous experience, I knew what it was and I knew what was going on. And let me tell you, it was fantastic. I was able to pass through walls, pass through the ceiling, pass through the floor, and I went to all these different rooms and saw surgeries going on, and went out into the waiting room. And anyway, I was able to go wherever I wanted with complete freedom of movement. There was no fear. I knew what was going on, and I just floated around the hospital for the entire, 30, 45 minutes of the procedure. I was just floating around having a big old time, and it was awesome. I'm not going to lie. And so at any rate, as soon as the anesthesia wore off or they woke me up, I was back inside my body, fully conscious, fully identified again with the body and all that. But I had the complete memory of the experience. Now, I've been told that when you're under anesthesia, typically, even if you dream, you don't remember your dreams or you don't remember anything about the experience or whatever. But I had full memory of that experience. And so, long story short, folks, you're not your body. I promise. And I promise you that you continue after the body dies. And that you exist apart from your body, outside of the body, beyond the confines of the body. I promise you that. It is true. I don't believe it. I know it. I know it. And so from this, and by the way, those are the only two out-of-body experiences I've ever had. To this day, I've never had another one after that. It would be cool if I had another one, but I don't seek them out. I didn't try to make that one happen. I didn't try to make the first one happen. They just both happened. Sort of randomly. So at any rate, from the near-death experience I had with the white light, the comforting, loving, blissful white light, and the astral experiences that I've had, especially that Tibetan Dream Yoga experience, and the two out-of-body experiences, I know that I'm not this body. I know the astral body is real, and I know that we continue on once the physical body is no longer viable. I know this. I know this. And so it's very popular for neuroscientists and people that study consciousness, these academic types, to claim that the brain produces consciousness and that consciousness comes about as a result of the physical body. And that once the physical body dies, we are no longer conscious. We no longer exist. We cease to exist once the physical body dies. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. Spoken by people who are ignorant and foolish. and know-it-alls, scientific materialists who think they know everything because they have a PhD after their name. And these people are naive and ignorant and foolish, quite frankly. And they claim to have knowledge of things that they don't have knowledge of because they've never had these experiences. I assure you that if one of these scientific materialists, if one of them were to have an out-of-body experience, they would no longer believe, of course, that, that the brain somehow produces consciousness, or that consciousness cannot exist apart from the human brain. I assure you their mind would change on that overnight, in an instant. But, again, as I've said on many of these podcast episodes, we do live in a dark age, a spiritually ignorant age, where the overwhelming majority of people, 99% or so, I don't know the exact percentage, are totally spiritually ignorant. And these are the people that control the mainstream dialogue and the mainstream narrative and the mainstream paradigm. And so we, in this dark age, worship at the feet of scientific materialists and physicists and neuroscientists, and anyone with a PhD after their name is worshipped like a god within our culture and society. This is unfortunate. This is unfortunate. Now, I have nothing against science. As I've said many times, I was a science teacher. I'm still a certified science teacher. And I taught science for years, and I have no problem whatsoever with science. At all. But scientific materialism is a sort of atheistic philosophy that permeates every part of our culture and society and influences how we think about spirituality and all of that. And it's a shame. But at any rate, I hope that this podcast episode has inspired you to continue on the path, and not necessarily to seek out these kinds of experiences, but if they should happen, that's wonderful, because it is proof that this is all real, and it motivates you to continue on the path. When you have these experiences, you are then more motivated to continue on the path because you know it's all real. Without these experiences, you're forced to believe. After these experiences, you simply know. And this is the difference between belief and knowledge, between religion and gnosis, between these religions that believe in God, believe in the soul, etc., versus the mystical traditions that have knowledge as their basis, direct experience or knowledge of the divine, direct experience or knowledge of the soul. And this is what we should be aiming for. Direct experience, knowledge, not belief. Please share this episode with like-minded individuals. Lots of love. Namaste.